On a frozen Montana morning, a broken man rode into town with barely enough money to save his land and walked out carrying the fate of two terrified children. A young woman stood silent at an auction block, her hand wrapped around her little brother's so tightly it hurt, because letting go meant losing everything. No screams, no chains, just debt, hunger, and a world that had already given up on them. One choice would change 3 lives forever. What happens next will make you believe in quiet miracles and second chances for the forgotten. Before we begin, tell me where you are watching from. Drop your country in the comments below. If you believe no child or animal should ever face fear alone, hit subscribe now and share this story with someone who needs hope. Late autumn in Montana had a way of stripping everything down to what was necessary. The town of Ash Hollow sat on the edge of the plains where the land rose into low, wind-scarred hills. Nothing here was dramatic, it was simply hard. The sky most mornings was the color of hammered iron, and the wind moved across the open ground with a steady purpose, as if it had been given a job and intended to finish it. On this day, a thin layer of snow lay in the shaded ditches and along fence rails, not enough to look beautiful, only enough to remind people what was coming. Ash Hollow's main street was short and practical, 2 rows of weathered buildings facing each other across a strip of dirt packed down by wagon wheels and boots. The general store carried everything from flour to nails. The saloon opened before noon and closed whenever the owner decided it should. A small church leaned slightly in the wind, its paint faded and its windows always clean. The bank sat a little apart from the rest, brick-faced and freshly scrubbed, as if it belonged to a different town altogether. 6 miles west, Ethan Walker's ranch lay in a shallow basin where the grass grew thin and the soil showed through in pale patches. The place was modest, a weathered house, a barn with boards replaced in different years and different shades, a corral, and a small pasture fenced with posts that had been reset more than once. A line of cottonwoods followed a creek that ran low this time of year, its water dark and slow under the cold. The ranch didn't look abandoned. It looked maintained by someone who could not afford to let anything fail. Ethan was 38. He was tall and thick through the shoulders in a way that came from daily labor, not from the gym or a careful diet. His hair was dark brown, usually too long in front because he cut it only when it started to interfere with work. His beard stayed as a rough shadow along his jaw and upper lip. He shaved when he remembered, and he rarely remembered. His face had strong angles, high cheekbones, a firm jawline, a straight nose that had been broken once and set slightly off. The most noticeable thing about him was his quiet. It wasn't the quiet of shyness or fear, it was the quiet of a man who had learned that talking didn't fix much, and that silence at least didn't make promises it couldn't keep. A year ago he had been different. Not cheerful exactly, Montana didn't produce many men who were, but steady in a way that felt warm. Then his wife died, and the warmth went out of the house as if someone had opened a door in winter. Her name had been Lily. She had been small but strong, with dark hair that she pinned up in a careless twist, and eyes that never seemed tired, no matter how long the day had been. She could talk to anyone and make them feel like they mattered. She could settle a nervous horse with a patient hand and a calm voice. Ethan had always assumed she would outlast both him and the ranch, because she had that kind of life in her. She had been 7 months pregnant when the wagon accident happened, an ordinary disaster made worse by weather and distance. It had been a night of ice and wind. A wheel cracked on a hidden patch of frozen road. The horse spooked. The wagon shifted too fast. Ethan remembered the sound of wood snapping, the sudden tilt, the sensation of being thrown into darkness and snow. He remembered running, yelling for help, using his hands until they bled. He remembered Lily's skin cooling under his palm while he waited for a doctor who arrived too late. By morning, she was gone. The baby did not survive either. Afterward, Ethan did what he knew how to do. He worked. He repaired fences, hauled water, stacked wood, mended harness straps, tended horses, and kept the stove fed through long nights. He didn't do these things because they healed him. He did them because the ranch required it, and because the alternative was sitting still in a house full of echoes. That morning, he stood in the barn doorway with a bucket of grain, listening to the horses shift in their stalls. They weren't fine animals meant for parades or photographs. They were ranch horses, practical, steady, and worn in the honest ways that working animals get worn. A bay mare with a single white sock on her hind leg tossed her head and snorted, impatient for breakfast. An older gelding, gray around the muzzle, watched Ethan with the calm seriousness of a creature that had seen many winters and expected to see at least one more. Ethan poured grain into the troughs, then checked the mare's hooves and ran a hand down the gelding's neck. The gelding leaned into the touch, just slightly. Ethan's fingers paused there for a moment longer than necessary, as if he needed to feel something living under his hand. Behind him, a dog padded into the barn and stopped beside his boots. Buck was a cattle dog mix, red and white, thick-coated, built low and tough. One ear stood straight up. The other bent over at the tip as if it had broken once and never bothered to straighten. His muzzle was graying and his eyes had a cloudy film that meant he didn't see as clearly as he used to. He was old, probably 12, maybe older. Still, he kept following Ethan as though loyalty were a duty, not a feeling. Buck pressed his head against Ethan's leg and sighed. Ethan scratched behind the dog's upright ear and said, "I know." He wasn't sure what he meant by it. He said it anyway. Buck's tail thumped once against the barn floor. The ranch needed money. That fact had been circling Ethan for months, tightening like a rope. He had always carried debt, nearly every rancher did, but Lily had been the one who kept the numbers from becoming fear. She tracked expenses, bargained for supplies, and somehow made the accounts balance even in bad seasons. After she died, the balance slipped. Ethan paid what he could. Then he paid late. Then he paid less. Cattle. Prices dropped. A late storm killed part of the hay crop. A section of fencing went down and had to be rebuilt before the herd wandered. Small problems multiplied because there was no longer anyone in the house who could talk Ethan through them, plan around them, or remind him that a hard month did not mean the end. 2 weeks earlier, the bank had sent Mr. Harlan out to the ranch. Harlan was a man with careful clothing and clean hands, gloves in weather that didn't require them. He rode up on a neat horse and tied it to the rail as if he expected the rail to be polished. He didn't step fully onto the porch, and he didn't look at the barn. He looked at the house, the roofline, the windows, the land stretching behind it. "Mr. Walker," Harlan said, polite in the way a man can be when he holds the leverage, "I don't want this to turn ugly." Ethan didn't invite him inside. He stood in the doorway and listened. The air smelled like wood smoke and cold. "We can restructure your loan," Harlan continued, "but I need to see good faith, a payment, something that indicates this property is still worth backing." Ethan understood what that meant. If Ethan couldn't pay, the ranch would become worth more to the bank as a foreclosure than as a working place. It would be sold off to someone with money, or it would be taken by someone who had been waiting for land like a wolf waits for a weakened animal. "How much?" Ethan asked. Harlan gave a number. It wasn't enormous. It wasn't small either. It was exactly the kind of number designed to be possible for a man who still had hope, and crushing for a man who didn't. After Harlan left, Ethan sat on the porch step with Buck lying beside him and stared at the pasture until the light drained out of the sky. He didn't cry. He didn't pray. He simply sat there and felt the truth settle into him. He was one bad month away from losing the last place Lily had lived. That was why, on this cold morning, Ethan decided to go into town. He would sell cattle. He would buy feed and salt, nails and flour, and, because the house felt too quiet without it, coffee. He would walk into the bank and make a payment, not because it guaranteed anything, but because he was not ready to surrender. He saddled his horse with practiced hands. He wore denim, a plain shirt patched at one elbow, and his father's heavy coat. The coat smelled faintly of tobacco and old leather. He pulled his hat low and checked the cinch twice. When he was done, he led the horse out of the barn and toward the gate. Buck followed, limping slightly in his back leg. "Not today," Ethan said. He crouched, cupped the dog's face in both hands for a brief moment, and looked into those cloudy eyes. "Stay with the house." Buck gave a soft, dissatisfied whine but turned back toward the porch, as if understanding that guarding the place mattered more than walking beside Ethan. The road to town cut across open ground, the kind of land where sound traveled and you could see a rider coming from far off. Wind pushed at Ethan's coat and tugged at the horse's mane. Ravens sat on fence posts and watched him pass. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called once, sharp and lonely, then fell silent. Halfway to Ash Hollow, snow began again, It came in light flakes at first, then thickened as the wind shifted, whipping it sideways so it stung Ethan's face. He lowered his head and urged the horse onward. The world narrowed to the road and the horse's steady movement beneath him. By the time the town appeared, it looked like a smudge in the snowfall. Dark roofs, pale sky, smoke from chimneys. Ethan rode in and tied his horse outside the general store. His boots hit the ground with a crunch and he stood still for a moment, letting his eyes adjust. Across the street, the bank's brick front looked as clean as ever, as if winter and grief and hunger were inconveniences that only happened to other people. Ethan could have turned away then. It would have been easy to ride home, pretend the numbers didn't exist, keep the ranch going until the bank forced the issue. But he'd learned what avoidance cost. It cost a man his choices, one by one. He walked to the store door and pushed it open. The bell above it rang, a small sound, bright and ordinary. For a second, that ordinary sound hit him strangely. Life was still moving. People were still buying flour and coffee, still feeding families, still planning for winter. Ethan stepped inside, shook snow from his coat, and felt the heat of the stove on his face. He had come to town to sell cattle and make a payment. That was the plan. That was the practical purpose. He did not yet know that before this day ended, he would see something that would wake the part of him that grief hadn't managed to kill. Ethan did not go straight to the bank after stepping out of the general store. He told himself it was because the snow had begun again, light but persistent, turning the street into a dull ribbon of mud and ice. The truth was simpler and harder to admit. Something in Walter Pierce's careless mention of a debt auction had lodged itself in his mind and refused to be ignored. The old stock pen sat at the edge of Ash Hollow, half forgotten, except when hard times pushed people there. The rails were rough and uneven, the ground trampled into a hardened mix of dirt and frozen slush. A flatbed wagon stood near the center, its boards darkened by age and weather. Around it gathered a loose crowd, men with hands shoved into coat pockets, women wrapped tight against the cold, boys old enough to linger but too young to understand what they were watching. The air carried the low murmur of voices and the sharp bite of winter. Ethan tied his horse to a post and stayed near the edge of the gathering. He kept his posture relaxed, shoulders loose, hands resting easily at his sides. Years of ranch work had taught him how to watch without appearing to. He had no intention of staying long. He had come only to see what kind of business was being done. The auctioneer stood on the wagon, a lean man in his early 40s with a trimmed beard and a voice trained to cut through wind and noise. His coat was well kept, his boots clean enough to suggest he didn't spend much time in mud. There was nothing cruel about his expression, but there was nothing kind either. He looked like a man who had learned to separate his work from his conscience in order to sleep at night. "Next contract," the auctioneer announced, glancing down at his papers. "Outstanding debt settlement, young woman and dependent child." A ripple of interest moved through the crowd. Ethan felt his jaw tighten before he understood why. Two figures were guided forward. The woman was young, barely into her 20s, but hardship had already shaped her. She was tall and slender, almost fragile at first glance, yet there was a firmness to the way she stood that contradicted the impression. Her shoulders were squared, her spine straight, as if she had trained herself not to bend, no matter the weight placed upon her. Her hair was light brown, worn in a tight braid that fell between her shoulder blades, practical and severe. Loose strands escaped near her temples, lifted by the wind. Her face was narrow, marked by high cheekbones and a straight nose reddened by cold. Her skin was pale, weathered by long exposure rather than neglect. Her eyes were a clear gray, alert, guarded, and unflinching. At her side stood a boy of about 6. He was small for his age, thin in the way children become when worry steals their appetite. His coat was too large, sleeves covering most of his hands, the hem brushing the ground. His hair, the same pale brown as the woman's, had been cut unevenly, as if done in haste or by someone unskilled. He clutched her hand with both of his, head lowered, shoulders hunched inward, as though he could fold himself smaller if he tried hard enough. The auctioneer cleared his throat. "Name's Sarah Miller," he said. "Boys Noah, parents deceased, significant debts left unpaid." A hush settled over the crowd, not out of respect but curiosity. Ethan's attention sharpened. The auctioneer continued, voice measured and factual. "Father took loans against his labor and property. Crop failures followed. Creditors came to collect, pressure mounted, parents were found dead in their homes shortly after. Official ruling, suicide. The word landed heavily, even among people accustomed to loss. Sarah did not react. She did not bow her head or wipe her eyes. She stared ahead, jaw set, lips pressed tight. Her free hand rested lightly on Noah's shoulder, steady and reassuring. The boy shifted closer to her leg, his grip tightening. Ethan felt something twist deep in his chest. He had seen the slow violence of debt before, how it hollowed people out long before it ended them. He thought of the way Lily had begun to worry quietly about money, even when she tried to hide it from him. He thought of the bankman's polite voice and clean gloves. Guardianship transferred to Uncle, the auctioneer went on. Uncle failed to resolve remaining obligations. Contract offered to settle outstanding balance. A man stood off to one side, half leaning against the rail. He was in his late 40s, with a bloated, ruddy face and bloodshot eyes that never seemed to settle on one place for long. His beard was untrimmed, his clothes stained and ill-fitting, as though he had slept in them more than once. He smelled faintly of sour liquor, even in the cold. This was the uncle. He kept his gaze fixed on the ground, jaw clenched, swaying slightly on his feet. He did not look at Sarah or the boy. Noah whimpered when someone behind him shifted impatiently. He stumbled a little on the uneven ground. Sarah caught him instantly, pulling him close, her arm firm around his shoulders. She bent just enough to murmur something to him, her voice too low to carry. Noah nodded once, though his face remained pressed into her coat. Ethan's hands curled into fists inside his pockets. Bidding starts at 600, the auctioneer called. Numbers rose, called out by men who spoke as if discussing livestock. Some eyes lingered on Sarah longer than necessary, appraising her with a casual entitlement that made Ethan's stomach turn. Sarah never looked back at them. She stared past the crowd, her expression carved from resolve rather than hope. 700. 8. Ethan told himself to leave. He reminded himself of the bank, of the thin margin keeping his ranch afloat. He reminded himself that he could not undo every injustice he witnessed. Then Noah stumbled again, this time catching his boot on a frozen rut. He would have fallen if Sarah hadn't braced herself and taken his weight. She went down on one knee, shielding him with her body, her hand cradling the back of his head. For a brief second, her eyes closed. When she rose again, her face was composed, but something fierce burned beneath the surface. That was when Ethan knew. The decision formed fully and cleanly, without panic. He did the math quickly, brutally. The money from the cattle sale, what the bank demanded, what he could postpone. The margin was narrow and dangerous, but it existed. 900, someone called. 1,000, another voice followed. Ethan stepped forward before doubt could catch him. His voice carried clearly, shaped by years of calling across wind and distance. 1,100. Heads turned. The uncle looked up briefly, confusion flickering across his face. The auctioneer paused, scanning the crowd. 1,100, he repeated. Any advance? 1,150. A man near the front snapped, irritation sharp in his tone. 12, Ethan said without hesitation. Silence followed. The man scowled, then shook his head and stepped back. No one else spoke. 1,200, the auctioneer said. Going once, going twice. Sold. The crowd loosened, interest fading now that the moment had passed. Sarah's shoulders dropped just slightly, as though she had been holding herself rigid for hours. She turned and looked directly at Ethan. Her gaze was steady, cautious, stripped of gratitude and heavy with suspicion. Ethan met it and nodded once, neither claiming credit nor offering reassurance he hadn't earned. A county clerk approached with paperwork. He was a small man with ink-stained fingers and a nervous habit of adjusting his collar. Ethan read every line carefully. The language was cold. Contracts, obligations, terms of service. He signed anyway, his hand steady. When the clerk gestured for Sarah and Noah to step forward, Sarah did so without hesitation. Up close, Ethan could see the exhaustion etched beneath her composure, the faint hollows under her eyes. Noah looked up at him, eyes wide and dark, searching. I'm Ethan Walker, he said quietly. I've got a ranch west of here. Sarah studied him for a moment longer than politeness required. Sarah Miller, she replied. This is my brother Noah. Noah said nothing, but he didn't look away. We'll head out before dark, Ethan said. We can talk on the way." Sarah nodded once. She didn't thank him. Ethan found he respected that more than words. As they walked away from the pens, snow began to fall again, soft and steady. Ethan felt the full weight of his choice settle onto him. Money spent he could barely spare, a future made more complicated. Yet beneath the worry was something quieter and firmer. For the first time since Lily died, he felt he had not merely endured the world, but answered it. They left Ash Hollow under a sky that could not decide what it wanted. Snow fell in thin, drifting sheets, then paused, then returned again, as if reconsidering. Ethan rode ahead, leading the horse at a steady pace, careful not to rush. Sarah walked beside the wagon he had borrowed from a nearby livery, Noah seated in the back with the supplies Ethan had purchased earlier. The distance between them was deliberate, not unfriendly, but respectful. Ethan understood instinctively that whatever trust might come later would not be earned by closeness too soon. The road west was narrow and uneven, worn into the land by years of use. Fields stretched out on either side, brown and brittle beneath the early winter cold. Fence posts leaned where the ground had shifted. The wind carried the dry smell of earth and the faint promise of heavier snow by nightfall. It was not a forgiving road, but it was familiar to Ethan. He had traveled it so many times that his body knew its curves better than his mind did. Noah sat quietly in the wagon, knees pulled up, his small hands wrapped tightly around the edge of a folded blanket. He watched the passing land with wide, solemn eyes. Every so often, he glanced at Ethan, then back to Sarah, as if measuring the distance between safety and uncertainty. He had not spoken since leaving the pens. Sarah walked with long, even strides, her posture controlled despite the cold and fatigue. Up close, Ethan could see how young she really was. There was a faint hollowness beneath her eyes, and the skin around them carried a tightness that came from long nights without proper rest. Her coat was thin, worn at the cuffs, clearly patched more than once. Yet there was nothing careless about her. She carried herself like someone who had learned that appearing weak invited disaster. After nearly a mile in silence, Sarah spoke. "How far is your ranch?" 6 miles from town," Ethan replied without turning. "Another 2 before the creek." She nodded. "And what exactly do you expect from us?" Ethan slowed his horse slightly, allowing the wagon to draw closer. He considered his words carefully. "Nothing tonight," he said. "You'll eat. You'll sleep. We'll talk tomorrow." Sarah studied him, her gray eyes sharp. "You didn't buy us to leave us idle." "No," he agreed. "But I didn't buy you to own you either." That earned him a brief look of surprise before her expression settled back into caution. Noah leaned forward then, peering around the edge of the wagon. "Is it far?" he asked softly. "Not much farther," Ethan said, glancing back at him. "You did fine today." Noah nodded once, satisfied, and settled back down. The ranch appeared gradually, revealed by the land rather than announced by it. A low house stood against the slope, its roof dark with age but intact. Smoke rose from the chimney, thin and steady. A barn sat to the right, solid if weathered, and a corral stretched beside it. Cottonwoods lined the creek, their bare branches rattling softly in the wind. As they drew closer, a red and white dog limped out onto the porch, one ear upright and the other bent at the tip. Buck stood still, tail wagging once, twice, as if confirming the world had returned in the correct order. His eyes, cloudy with age, fixed on Ethan first, then shifted toward the newcomers. "That's Buck," Ethan said. "He's old, mostly harmless." Buck hobbled closer, sniffing the air. He circled the wagon slowly, cautious but curious. When he reached Noah, he stopped and sat, head tilted. Noah froze. "It's all right," Sarah said quietly, though her hand hovered protectively near her brother. Buck leaned forward and sniffed Noah's boot, then sneezed and sat back again, tail thumping once against the dirt. Noah let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. "He's funny," Noah said. Ethan allowed himself a small smile. Inside, the house was warm but plain. A stone fireplace dominated the main room, a kettle already steaming on the stove. The furniture was sturdy and practical, built to last rather than impress. There were no unnecessary decorations, but the space was clean. It felt lived in without feeling crowded by memory. "You can put him here," Ethan said, opening the door to a small room just off the main area. Inside was a narrow bed with a thick quilt folded neatly at the foot. Sarah hesitated. "You're giving him a room?" "For now," Ethan said. "He'll sleep better than on a wagon." She nodded and helped Noah down. The boy's movements were sluggish now, exhaustion finally claiming him. Sarah removed his boots carefully and pulled the quilt up to his chin. Noah was asleep before his head settled fully on the pillow. When Sarah returned to the main room, Ethan was ladling stew into bowls. The smell of beef and root vegetables filled the space, rich and grounding. "Sit," he said, nodding toward the table. Sarah sat stiffly at first, hands folded in her lap. She didn't reach for the bowl until Ethan sat across from her. "You're wondering what comes next," he said. "Yes." "I need help around the ranch," Ethan continued. "Housekeeping, cooking, some light work if you're willing. In return, you and your brother have food, shelter, and wages. Actual wages." Sarah stared at him. "You paid $1,200? "I paid to keep you from someone else," he said evenly. "The contract ends here." Silence stretched between them, thick and uncertain. "And if we choose to leave?" she asked. "You can," Ethan replied. "I won't stop you." Sarah studied his face, searching for deception. She found none, only weariness and something steady beneath it. "Why?" she asked finally. Ethan leaned back slightly, fingers wrapped around his cup. "Because I know what it's like to lose family, and because the world takes enough without help." Sarah lowered her gaze, blinking once. "Thank you," she said quietly. That night, snow fell harder, piling against the windows. Sarah locked her door before sleeping, habit overriding trust. Ethan did not comment. Before dawn, Ethan was awake, brewing coffee. He heard soft footsteps and turned to see Noah standing in the doorway, hair tousled, eyes still heavy with sleep. "Morning," Ethan said. Noah nodded. Buck said hello. The dog thumped his tail by the fire. Sarah appeared moments later, cautious but calmer than the night before. Ethan handed her a cup of coffee without ceremony. The road had brought them together. What followed would depend on choices still to be made. Morning came quietly to the ranch, not with birdsong, but with the low creak of the house settling and the distant sound of wind moving through bare cottonwoods. A thin layer of frost coated the ground outside, turning the grass brittle and pale. Inside, the fire had burned down to embers, and the air carried the faint scent of wood smoke and last night's stew. Sarah woke before dawn, the habit ingrained too deeply to ignore. For a moment, she lay still in the unfamiliar bed, listening. The house did not feel hostile. It did not feel welcoming either. It simply existed, solid and patient, as if waiting to see what kind of people would occupy it. She slipped from beneath the quilt and crossed the small room to check on Noah. He slept curled on his side, one arm tucked beneath his chin, his breathing slow and even. The lines of tension that had marked his face in town were softened now, replaced by the loose calm of a child who felt, at least for the moment, safe enough to rest. Sarah watched him longer than necessary, then pulled the quilt higher around his shoulders before closing the door quietly behind her. The main room was dim, lit only by the faint glow from the stove. Ethan stood at the counter, his sleeves rolled up, pouring coffee into a tin cup. He had shaved, leaving his jaw sharp and clean, though the faint shadow of beard already showed through. His hair was damp, combed back with his fingers, and he looked more awake than the hour suggested. "You didn't wake him, did you?" he asked quietly when he noticed her. "No," Sarah replied. "He's sleeping well." "That's good." He slid a cup toward her. "Coffee." She hesitated only a moment before taking it. The warmth seeped into her hands, grounding her. She didn't thank him. Gratitude felt premature, too fragile to trust. They stood in silence for a few minutes, sipping coffee, listening to the wind outside. Buck lay near the hearth, curled into himself. One cloudy eye half open. He lifted his head when Sarah shifted, thumped his tail once, then settled again. Ethan spoke first. "I'll show you around today," he said. "Nothing heavy, just the house, the yard. Noah can stay close." Sarah nodded. "I can work." "I know," he said simply. "That's not the point." After breakfast, Ethan stepped outside to check the animals. Sarah followed, pulling her coat tighter against the cold. The barn stood solid against the pale sky, its boards weathered but sound. Inside, the horses shifted and snorted softly, steam rising from their bodies. Ethan moved among them with an easy familiarity, his hands steady, his voice low. The animals responded to him not with fear but recognition. Noah lingered near the doorway at first, hesitant. Buck padded up beside him, nudging his knee gently with a cold nose. "He won't knock you over," Ethan said, glancing back. "Too old for that." Noah crouched slowly and reached out. Buck sniffed his fingers, then leaned into the touch with a soft sigh. Noah smiled, small at first, then wider. "He's nice," Noah said. "He is," Ethan agreed. "Stubborn, but nice." Sarah watched from a distance, something tight loosening in her chest. It had been a long time since she had seen Noah interact with anyone without fear. The rest of the morning passed quietly. Ethan showed Sarah the kitchen garden, mostly dormant now, beds covered against frost, and the small laundry shed. He explained where supplies were kept, how the stove drew best when the wind shifted, which boards in the floor creaked loudest at night. "You'll notice things that need fixing," he said. "Tell me, or fix them if you'd rather." She raised an eyebrow. "You don't mind?" "I mind things breaking," he replied, "not people trying." By midday, the sky had cleared, leaving the land washed pale and bright. Sarah prepared a simple meal, moving through the kitchen with practiced efficiency. She did not ask permission to rearrange a few items, and Ethan didn't comment when he noticed. It felt like a small negotiation, unspoken, but understood. That afternoon, a rider approached from the east. Ethan saw him first, straightening slightly as the horse came into view. The man dismounted near the fence and leaned casually against the post, hat tipped back. Tom Bennett was in his early 40s, broad and solid, with a thick mustache and a face weathered by sun and wind. He had grown up ranching and carried himself with the easy confidence of someone who knew his place in the world. A childhood injury had left him with a slight limp, and it had tempered his once quick temper into something slower, more deliberate. "Afternoon, Ethan," Tom called. "Saw tracks headed your way. Figured you might have company." Ethan nodded. "Tom, this is Sarah, and her brother, Noah." Tom removed his hat politely, nodding to Sarah. "Ma'am?" Sarah inclined her head, wary but civil. Tom's gaze flicked briefly to Noah, who stood close to Buck, then back to Ethan. "Heard about the auction," Tom said quietly. "Town's already talking." Ethan's jaw tightened. "Let them." Tom studied him for a moment, then nodded. "If you need anything, you know where I am." He glanced at Sarah again. "You're welcome here. Don't mind the noise. It fades." With that, he mounted his horse and rode off, leaving the land quiet again. That evening, after supper, Sarah sat at the table mending a tear in Noah's coat. Ethan watched from the doorway, noticing the way her hands moved, quick, precise, practiced by necessity. Noah sat on the floor, rolling a small wooden horse bucket unearthed from somewhere beneath the couch. "Tomorrow," Ethan said, "I'll go into town for supplies. You can come if you want." Sarah's needle paused. "Why?" "So people see you with me," he said, "so they understand." She considered this. "And if I don't want them to?" "Then you don't," he replied. "It's your choice." That night, Sarah did not lock her door. She lay awake for a long time, listening to the quiet sounds of the ranch. Somewhere down the hall, Noah shifted in his sleep. The wind rattled the cottonwoods, steady and unthreatening. For the first time since their parents' deaths, Sarah allowed herself to imagine something beyond survival, not hope exactly, but the faint outline of it. In the early hours before dawn touched the hills, she slept. The first real test came not with raised voices or sudden violence, but with paper. It arrived folded and official-looking, carried out from town by a boy barely old enough to shave. He rode up late in the afternoon, his horse thin and impatient, dust clinging to his boots. Ethan was repairing a loose hinge on the corral gate when the boy stopped at the fence and cleared his throat with exaggerated importance. "Mr. Walker?" he asked. Ethan straightened slowly. "That's me." The boy handed over the envelope, nodded once, and turned his horse without waiting for a response. He rode off as quickly as he had come, clearly relieved to be rid of the task. Ethan stared at the envelope for a long moment before opening it. The paper inside was stiff, stamped with the county seal. He read it once, then again, jaw tightening with each line. It was a notice, formal, impersonal, and quietly threatening. A claim had been filed contesting the labor contract he had purchased at auction, guardianship, improper transfer, allegations of coercion. He folded the paper carefully and slipped it into his coat pocket. Sarah noticed the change in him before he said a word. She was hanging laundry near the house, her sleeves rolled up, hair pinned back against the wind. Noah sat on the porch steps beside Buck, rolling a smooth stone between his palms. "Something wrong?" she asked. "Someone's decided to make trouble." Ethan replied evenly. She did not press him then, but that night, after Noah was asleep and the house had settled into its quiet, she did. They sat at opposite ends of the table, a single lamp casting long shadows. The paper lay between them. "My uncle," Sarah said after reading it. Her voice was flat, unsurprised. "He wouldn't let this go." Ethan watched her carefully. "You know what he's claiming?" "That he never consented," she said. "That he was drunk, that he was taken advantage of." "Was he?" "Yes," she answered without hesitation. "To all of it. And that's exactly why he did it." Ethan leaned back, folding his arms. "He's asking the county to void the contract. If they do, he'll try to reclaim you, or sell the debt again." Sarah's hands clenched in her lap. "He won't get Noah. Not if I have anything to say about it." She looked up sharply. "This could cost you the ranch." "I know." Silence stretched between them, heavy but honest. "My parents died because of debt," Sarah said quietly. "Not because they were weak, because they were trapped. I won't let that happen to my brother." "You won't have to," Ethan replied. "I didn't buy a piece of paper to hand you back to the same hell." The following morning, they rode into town together. Sarah insisted on coming. She dressed carefully, not to impress, but to be taken seriously. Her coat was clean, her braid neat, her posture controlled. Noah rode beside Ethan on the wagon seat, wrapped in a thick blanket, Buck trotting alongside. Ash Hollow watched them arrive. At the courthouse, the air smelled of ink and dust. Wooden benches lined the walls. Behind a tall desk sat Margaret Holloway, the county clerk, a woman in her late 50s with iron-gray hair pulled into a tight bun. Her eyes were sharp, her mouth thin, and her expression suggested she had seen every version of desperation and learned to separate truth from noise. She read the papers in silence, tapping one finger against the desk. "Your uncle filed the claim last night," she said to Sarah. "Mr. Thomas Miller, history of public intoxication, no steady employment." Sarah nodded. "That's him. And you contest his claim?" "Yes." Margaret studied her more closely then, her gaze lingering on Sarah's face, her hands, the way she held herself. "You understand what this means," she said. "If the contract is voided, custody becomes flexible." Sarah's voice didn't waver. "My uncle is not fit to raise a child. He never has been." Ethan spoke then. "I'm willing to appear in court, to testify to the conditions of the auction, the state they were in, and my intentions." Margaret's eyes flicked to him. "You're already on thin ice with the bank, Mr. Walker." "I'm aware." She leaned back in her chair, considering. "This won't be settled today, but the claim won't move forward without a hearing. That gives you time." "How much?" Ethan asked. "A few weeks," she said, "if the weather doesn't delay us." Outside, Sarah released a breath she'd been holding. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "You shouldn't have to fight my battles." Ethan looked down at Noah, who was watching a sparrow hop along the dirt near the steps. "Seems like they're ours now." The confrontation came sooner than expected. They were unloading feed that evening when a rider appeared at the edge of the property. The man swayed slightly in the saddle, his coat unbuttoned, his beard unkempt. Even from a distance, Sarah recognized him. Her uncle dismounted poorly, nearly stumbling as his boots hit the ground. His eyes were bloodshot, his face flushed from drink and cold. "Sarah," he called, "there you are." Ethan stepped forward, placing himself between the man and the house. "You're trespassing," the uncle laughed, a harsh sound. "I'm family, and those kids are mine." "No," Sarah said, her voice steady. "They're not." He turned on her, eyes narrowing. "You think you can just walk away from what you owe, from what your parents left behind?" Ethan's hands clenched at his sides. "You'll leave now." "Or what?" the man sneered. You gonna shoot me, Walker, in front of them? Noah pressed into Sarah's side, trembling. Ethan did not raise his voice. You'll leave because the law says you have no claim until the hearing, and because if you come back drunk again, I'll have the sheriff waiting. The uncle hesitated, anger flickering behind the haze. He spat into the dirt and laughed again. This isn't over. No, Ethan agreed. It isn't. The man mounted his horse clumsily and rode off, leaving the air heavy with the smell of liquor and dust. That night, Noah had nightmares. Sarah sat beside his bed until his breathing evened out, her hand resting lightly on his chest. When she finally stepped back into the main room, she found Ethan awake, seated at the table. You didn't sign up for this, she said. Ethan met her gaze. I signed up when I said you were safe here. For the first time, Sarah did not argue. Winter did not arrive all at once. It crept in by degrees, settling into the ranch through longer nights, brittle mornings, and a cold that seemed to work its way inward rather than merely resting on the skin. After Thomas Miller's visit, the land felt altered, as though the threat he carried had seeped into the soil itself. Ethan noticed it in small things, the way Buck stayed closer to the house, the way Sarah paused before opening the door each morning, the way Noah startled at sudden sounds. Ethan did not pretend the danger had passed. Instead, he prepared. He fixed the latch on the gate nearest the road and reinforced the corral fence with posts hauled in from the far pasture. He kept the rifle clean and within reach, though he never let Noah see it. The work was steady, deliberate, the kind that left his hands aching but his thoughts clear. There was comfort in tasks that had known shapes and honest outcomes. Sarah watched him from the porch one afternoon, her arms wrapped around herself against the cold. She had taken on her duties without complaint, keeping the house, managing the meals, mending what needed mending. She worked with quiet efficiency, but beneath it ran a current of vigilance that never fully eased. Ethan recognized it. He lived with the same current himself. You don't have to fortify the place like a fortress, she said finally. I'm not, he replied, tightening a bolt, just making it harder for trouble to wander in. She nodded, accepting that. After a moment, she added, he won't come back sober. Ethan glanced up. He won't come back alone either. That was the truth they didn't speak too often. Men like Thomas Miller rarely acted without encouragement, and Ash Hollow had no shortage of people willing to stir a pot if they thought there was something to be gained. Rumors traveled faster than winter storms. 2 days later, a wagon approached from the east carrying a woman Ethan had not seen in years. Clara Hayes stepped down from the driver's seat with practiced ease. She was in her early 40s, tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair streaked prematurely with silver and cut short for practicality. Her face bore strong lines carved by wind and sun, and her eyes, sharp, intelligent, and unafraid, missed very little. She had once been a schoolteacher before her husband's death forced her into work that paid more steadily. Now, she served as the county's traveling advocate, helping place orphaned children and investigating claims of abuse when the courts moved too slowly. Well, Clara said, planting her boots firmly in the dirt, you look exactly like a man who didn't expect to see me again. Ethan allowed himself a brief smile. Didn't expect the county to send you. They didn't, she replied. I heard about the filing, thought I'd better see things for myself. Sarah emerged from the house then, Noah just behind her. Clara's gaze shifted, immediately, softening as it settled on the boy. And this must be Noah, Clara said, crouching slightly so she wasn't towering over him. I'm Clara. Noah studied her for a moment, then nodded once. Buck likes you, he said, pointing at the dog who had wandered over and promptly sat at Clara's feet. Clara laughed quietly. That's a good sign. He's got better judgment than most people I know. They went inside, the house filling with the unfamiliar presence of someone who carried authority without arrogance. Clara asked questions carefully, never prying, but missing nothing. She listened as Sarah spoke of her parents, the debt, the night everything collapsed. She listened as Ethan explained the auction, the contract, the notice filed by Thomas. When Sarah finished, her hands were clenched in her lap. Noah sat close, leaning against her side. Clara folded her hands. You understand, she said gently, that the court will weigh stability heavily, where the child sleeps, who feeds him, who protects him. Sarah's throat tightened. He's my brother. And that matters, Clara said. But the law doesn't run on love alone. Ethan leaned forward. Then tell us what it runs on. Clara met his gaze. Consistency. Proof. Witnesses. She glanced toward the window. And time. Over the next week, Clara remained at the ranch, observing without intrusion. She watched Noah help feed the chickens, his confidence growing in small increments. She noted the way Sarah structured their days, the quiet order she brought to the household. She watched Ethan teach Noah how to hold a piece of wood steady while whittling, his patience unforced, his corrections gentle. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills, Clara joined Ethan on the porch. You didn't remarry, she said, not accusing, simply noting. No, Ethan replied. Didn't seem right. Grief can make a man careful, she said, or reckless. Which am I? Careful, she answered after a pause, but not closed. He considered that. The test came on a night when the wind rose hard and sudden, rattling the windows and driving snow sideways across the yard. Ethan had just banked the fire when Buck lifted his head and growled low in his throat. Ethan was on his feet instantly, moving toward the door. He caught a glimpse of movement near the far fence, a lantern bobbing unsteadily. Sarah stood frozen near the stairs. Noah clutched to her side. Is it him? Stay here, Ethan said. He took the rifle from its place by the door and stepped outside. Two figures stood by the fence. One was unmistakable even from a distance. Thomas Miller, hunched and unsteady, his coat flapping in the wind. Beside him stood another man, taller, broader, his face hidden beneath the brim of his hat. He had the build of someone accustomed to force, his posture aggressive, his stance wide and ready. Walker, Thomas called. His voice slurred. We're here to settle this. Ethan raised the rifle, not aimed, but visible. There's nothing to settle tonight. The taller man stepped forward slightly. You're on borrowed ground, he said. His voice was calm, practiced. That boy's worth money. Something cold and steady settled into Ethan's chest. You're trespassing. Behind him, the door opened just enough for Clara to step onto the porch, her presence sudden and commanding. I wouldn't advise this, she said clearly. Sheriff's already been notified. That was a gamble. But it worked. The taller man hesitated, calculating. Thomas swore loudly, staggering back a step. This isn't over, Thomas snarled. No, Clara agreed. But it won't be tonight. They left soon after, their lantern bobbing away into the storm. Inside, Noah shook with delayed fear. Ethan knelt in front of him, lowering the rifle and setting it aside. You're safe, he said. I won't let anyone take you. Noah threw his arms around him without thinking, clinging hard. Ethan froze for a heartbeat, then wrapped his arms around the boy, holding him carefully, as if afraid to break something precious. Sarah watched, tears tracking silently down her cheeks. Later, when the house had gone quiet again, Clara spoke softly to Ethan. That, she said, is what the court needs to see. The next morning, the storm passed, leaving the world clean and bright. Clara prepared to leave. I'll testify, she said, and I'll make sure the sheriff remembers what he saw last night. Sarah exhaled slowly. Thank you. Clara smiled faintly. You're building something worth protecting here. Don't stop. As her wagon disappeared down the road, Ethan stood with Sarah and Noah watching the empty land. Winter had not eased its grip, but for the first time it no longer felt like something they faced alone. The days that followed the storm settled into a tense, watchful quiet. Winter tightened its grip on the land, hardening the ground and sharpening the air. But it was the waiting that pressed hardest on the ranch. The threat Thomas Miller had carried to their doorstep did not return, yet it lingered like a bruise beneath the skin, tender and easily stirred. Ethan felt it each time the wind rose suddenly or a distant sound carried across the frozen pasture. Preparation became their shared language. Ethan rose before dawn to tend the animals and reinforce what could still be strengthened. He worked with a steady patience born of long habit, but there was an edge to him now, a vigilance that had not been there before. He spoke little, but when he did, his words were precise. The rifle remained by the door, always cleaned, always visible enough to serve as warning without becoming spectacle. Sarah, for her part, imposed structure on the days. She organized meals, set routines, and insisted Noah keep to them even when the cold made excuses tempting. Breakfast at the same hour, lessons at the table after chores, letters, numbers, reading from a thin, worn book Ethan had found tucked away in a cupboard, a relic from a different life. Stability, Clara had said, mattered. Noah adapted with a resilience that surprised them both. He followed Ethan through small tasks, learning how to carry kindling, how to scatter feed without startling the chickens, how to speak softly around horses. His fear did not vanish, but it loosened its hold, replaced by curiosity and the careful confidence of a child who had begun to believe the ground beneath him might stay solid. One afternoon, as snow drifted lazily across the yard, Noah sat on the floor carving clumsy shapes into a scrap of wood. Ethan crouched beside him, guiding his hands. "Not too deep," Ethan said. "Let the blade do the work." Noah nodded, tongue caught between his teeth in concentration. Sarah watched from the table, pretending to mend while committing the image to memory. She had learned not to take such moments for granted. 2 days before the hearing, Tom Bennett rode up again. He dismounted stiffly, his familiar limp more pronounced in the cold. His mustache was rimed with frost, his coat heavy and well-worn. Tom had always been a blunt man, but years of managing his temper after the injury had taught him when to choose his words carefully. "Heard the date set," Tom said once he was inside, warming his hands by the fire. "County courthouse. Sheriff will be there." Ethan nodded. "Claire's testifying." "That'll help." Tom hesitated, then added, "So will this." He produced a folded paper from his coat. It was a signed statement, his own account of Thomas Miller's drunken behavior over the years, including the night Thomas had come to Ethan's ranch with another man in tow. "I saw enough," Tom said simply. "Didn't feel right keeping quiet." Sarah swallowed. "Thank you." Tom waved it off. "Kid deserves better than a drunk with debts." The morning of the hearing dawned gray and still. The sky hung low, heavy with the promise of more snow. Ethan hitched the wagon before sunrise. Sarah dressed Noah in his cleanest clothes, smoothing his hair with careful hands. She wore a plain dress, neat and practical, her hair braided tightly back. There was nothing soft about her appearance that morning. She had chosen strength over comfort. They rode into Ash Hollow in silence. The courthouse stood squat and unremarkable, its stone walls cold to the touch. Inside, the air smelled of dust and old paper. Wooden benches lined the room, polished smooth by years of anxious hands. Margaret Holloway sat at her desk, expression unreadable as she organized the day's proceedings. Thomas Miller arrived late. He staggered slightly as he entered, though whether from drink or nerves was unclear. He had shaved poorly, leaving patches of stubble along his jaw. His eyes were bloodshot, his movements jerky. He avoided Sarah's gaze entirely, focusing instead on the floor as if it might offer him protection. Beside him stood the man Ethan had seen during the storm, a broad-shouldered figure with a heavy beard and a face carved into permanent scowl lines. His name, Ethan learned, was Leonard Pike. Pike was known in the region as an enforcer of sorts, a man who lent his size to other people's disputes for the right price. A childhood spent fighting for scraps had shaped him into someone who believed force was the clearest language. The judge entered shortly after, a thin man with deep-set eyes and a stooped posture that suggested years bent over books rather than fields. He listened more than he spoke, his gaze moving carefully between speakers. The case unfolded slowly, methodically. Thomas claimed guardianship by default, citing blood ties and unpaid debts. His voice wavered, rising defensively when questioned. Under scrutiny, his story thinned. He contradicted himself more than once. When asked about his employment, he grew belligerent. When asked about his drinking, he laughed harshly and refused to answer. Sarah spoke next. She stood straight, hands folded in front of her, voice steady despite the tremor she could not entirely suppress. She spoke of her parents, of the loans, of the night the creditors came. She did not dramatize their deaths. She stated the facts plainly, trusting the weight of them to stand on their own. She spoke of Noah, of sleepless nights, of fear, of the promise she had made to keep him safe. Ethan followed. He described the auction, the conditions Sarah and Noah had been in, the contract he had purchased, and the home he had provided since. He spoke without embellishment, his words measured and deliberate. He didn't present himself as a savior. He presented himself as a man who had made a choice and stood by it. Clara testified last. She spoke of her observations, of Noah's progress, of Sarah's consistency, of Ethan's household as a place of structure and care. She referenced the incident during the storm, the attempted intimidation, and the presence of Leonard Pike. When Tom Bennett's statement was read into record, Thomas erupted. "This is a setup," he shouted, surging to his feet before being ordered to sit. "They took what was mine." The judge's gaze hardened. "Sit down, Mr. Miller. You will have your answer shortly." The room fell silent as the judge reviewed the papers one final time. At last he spoke. "Temporary guardianship remains with Sarah Miller," he said. "The labor contract stands. Mr. Walker is recognized as legal employer and protector of residents. Mr. Miller is ordered to maintain distance until further review. Violation will result in arrest." The words landed like a held breath finally released. Sarah's knees nearly buckled. Ethan reached out instinctively, steadying her elbow. Noah looked between them, confusion giving way to understanding when Sarah dropped to her knees and wrapped him in her arms. Outside, snow began to fall again, soft and steady. They did not celebrate on the ride home. Relief was too fragile for that. Instead, there was quiet, a deep, shared quiet that felt earned. That evening, as the fire crackled low and the ranch settled into its familiar sounds, Ethan stood on the porch watching the snow gather along the fence rails. Sarah joined him, pulling her coat close. "It's not over forever," she said. "No," Ethan replied, "but it's enough for now." She nodded. "Thank you for standing when it mattered." Ethan looked out across the land, then back at the house where Noah slept. That's what family does. Winter eased its grip slowly, not with warmth, but with familiarity. The snow stayed, the cold stayed, yet the days no longer felt as though they might collapse under their own weight. After the hearing, the ranch seemed to breathe differently. The land was the same, hard ground, pale sky, fences half buried in drifts. But the tension that had tightened every moment loosened, just enough to allow ordinary life to resume. Ordinary, Ethan learned, was a fragile thing. The ruling had brought safety, not certainty. Thomas Miller was ordered to keep his distance, but orders did not erase men like him. Still, the sheriff rode by twice that week, slow and deliberate, his presence a quiet reminder that the law now had eyes on the ranch. Leonard Pike did not return. Whether it was caution or calculation that kept him away, Ethan did not know, and he did not waste energy guessing. What mattered was what happened inside the house. Noah slept through the night more often than not now. When nightmares came, they were shorter, their grip weaker. He woke calling for Sarah instead of screaming, his small body no longer rigid with terror but reaching for reassurance. Sarah met him every time, steady and unhurried, murmuring words that carried no panic. Ethan listened from the hallway once, unseen, and felt something settle quietly in his chest. The days filled themselves with work and learning. Sarah moved through the ranch with growing confidence, her understanding of its rhythms deepening. She learned which boards warped in damp weather, how much coffee Ethan drank without remark, how Buck preferred his food soaked when his teeth bothered him. She never overstepped, but she no longer hovered at the edges either. This was no longer a place she merely occupied. It was becoming a place she shaped. Ethan noticed the change in small, undeniable ways. She hummed sometimes while working, barely audible, a habit that seemed to surprise her as much as it did him. She argued when she thought he was wrong, not sharply, but firmly. She laughed once, suddenly, when Buck stole a biscuit from the table and waddled away with guilty dignity. The sound startled them both. One afternoon, as the sun hung low and weak in the sky, Sarah came to Ethan with a folded paper in her hands. "I received this from Clara," she said. Ethan set aside the harness he had been mending. "And?" "She wants to know our long-term plan," Sarah replied. "Schooling for Noah, guardianship arrangements, permanence." The words sat between them. Ethan leaned back against the workbench, crossing his arms. "What do you want?" Sarah hesitated. It was the first time she had done so in days. "I want him to have something steady, a future that doesn't depend on who shows up drunk at the door." "And you?" She met his gaze. "I want to stop living like everything can be taken tomorrow." Ethan nodded slowly. He understood that desire better than most. The following Sunday, they went into town together, not for court or confrontation, but for supplies and something resembling normalcy. Ash Hollow regarded them with cautious curiosity. Some faces softened, others remained sharp with judgment. The town, like the law, did not move quickly. At the general store, Walter Pierce peered over his spectacles, interest flickering openly. "Looks like things worked out," he said. "For now," Ethan replied evenly. Walter glanced at Sarah, then at Noah, who stood holding Buck's collar. "Boy's looking better," he said. Sarah inclined her head. "He's sleeping." "That'll do it," Walter muttered, already turning back to his ledger. Outside, a woman approached them near the hitching rail. She was in her mid-30s, with fair hair tucked beneath a knitted cap and a posture that suggested both kindness and resolve. Her name, she introduced, was Helen Crowley. She taught the small group of children who gathered each week in the church basement. "If you're interested," Helen said to Sarah, "Noah would be welcome. We don't have much, but we make do." Sarah glanced at Ethan. He nodded once. "We'll come by," she said. That night, snow began to fall again, soft and unhurried. Ethan stood by the window, watching the flakes drift down when Sarah joined him. "I need to ask you something," she said. He turned, attentive. "All right." "If Clara pushes for a more permanent arrangement," Sarah said carefully, "would you object?" Ethan understood what she was really asking. He did not answer immediately. He thought of Lily, of promises made and broken by fate. He thought of the risk, of loving something deeply enough to lose it again. "I wouldn't object," he said finally, "but I won't decide for you." She exhaled, a breath she had been holding. "I don't want charity." "This isn't that," Ethan replied. "It's a choice." They stood in silence, the weight of it settling gently rather than crushingly between them. Weeks passed. The cold lingered, but the days lengthened. Noah began attending lessons with Helen, returning home each time with new words, new questions, and a fierce pride in his progress. Buck waited at the fence every afternoon, tail wagging slowly, ears alert. Then one evening, Clara returned. She arrived without ceremony, stepping down from her wagon with a familiar steadiness. Her expression was softer this time. "The county's prepared to finalize," she said once inside. "Guardianship can be transferred permanently. Mr. Miller failed to appear for review, his claims collapsing under its own weight." Sarah closed her eyes briefly. "What does that mean?" "It means Noah stays where he is," Clara replied. "Legally." Noah, sensing the importance of the moment, looked between them. "I don't have to go?" "No," Sarah said, dropping to her knees and pulling him close. "You don't." Ethan watched, his throat tight. Later, after Noah was asleep, Clara spoke quietly to Ethan. "You've done well," she said, "but understand this, permanence cuts both ways." "I know," Ethan replied. Clara nodded. "Good, then I'll leave you to it." After she was gone, the house felt unusually still. Sarah found Ethan on the porch, staring out at the snow-covered land. "Clara said you could be named legal guardian as well," she said softly, "if you wanted." Ethan did not look away. "And what do you want?" She stepped closer. "I want Noah to grow up knowing he belongs, not just to me, to a family." Ethan turned then, meeting her eyes fully. The space between them felt charged, fragile. "I won't pretend this is simple," he said, "or safe." "I don't need safe," Sarah replied. "I need real." The wind moved through the cottonwoods, low and steady. Ethan nodded once. "Then let's do it right." They stood there a long time, not touching, letting the decision take root. Inside, Buck shifted in his sleep, tail thumping softly against the floor. Winter still lay heavy on the land. The future remained uncertain, but the choice had been made, not by law alone, but by the quiet, deliberate will of people who had already survived too much to settle for less than truth. Sometimes miracles don't arrive with thunder or blinding light. Sometimes they come quietly, through the hands of a tired man who chooses kindness when no one is watching, through the courage of a woman who refuses to let fear decide her child's future, through a child who dares to trust again. In moments like these, we are reminded that God does not always change the storm. Often, He sends someone who is willing to stand in it with us. In our daily lives, we may feel forgotten, overwhelmed by loss, debt, loneliness, or fear. But this story whispers a gentle truth. You are never as alone as you think. God is still working, sometimes through strangers, sometimes through small choices, sometimes through you. If this story touched your heart, take a moment to reflect on where you are today. Have you been someone's miracle? Or are you still waiting for one? Please share this story with someone who needs hope tonight. Leave a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. We read every one. And if you believe that love, faith, and compassion can still change lives, subscribe to this channel so we can continue sharing stories that heal. May God bless you, protect your family, and surround you with peace. May He guide those who feel lost, comfort those who are hurting, and remind every soul watching that quiet miracles still happen every single day. Amen.